I was a senior when this happened. Senioritis had fully kicked in. It was football season. Our high school was always big on football games because our football team was actually good. And there's nothing else to do in our boring country as town. One day at school, we were in some joke of an elective. My friend JJ was in this class with me, so we'd always mess around. It was a Friday, and there was a football game later that day, so we planned to go, and JJ, being the sweet talker he's always been, spun his chair around to face these girls, Kayla and Ashley, and asked them to go to the football game with us. We already knew them well, so it wasn't weird of him to invite them or anything. They seemed down to meet us later. So JJ dropped me off at home after school, and like 4 hours later, he picked me up, and then we picked up Kayla and Ashley. Then we drove to the school back parking lot by the woods. We had some Four Locos in the car, making sure nobody was passing by. Then we poured some more into water bottles to bring to the bleachers with us. We walked over to make sure we got good seats at the top row of the bleachers. Since the game started late, it started getting dark during the third quarter, and by the fourth quarter, it was dark. Our team was losing pretty bad for a change this game. So bad even that a lot of the kids in the bleachers were leaving early. We just stayed planning on hanging out on the field after anyway. The game ended and our team lost really bad, and so the field and bleachers were quiet. People were scurrying off the bleachers. The team rushed back inside the locker room in embarrassment, and the away team slowly made their way back to the buses. Within 10 minutes, we were among the only people left in the bleachers, minus a couple others and maybe a couple people in the field. We were honestly drunk by this point, and the team's defeat wasn't ruining our fun. When the field lights turned off, it was basically pitch black here, minus the moonlight. Everyone was gone. We went to go lay in the field. JJ ran to his car to get more alcohol. By now, it was probably 10:00. JJ said, "Let's go in the woods next to the football field." The girls, of course, were scared, and that's why the idea seemed fun. When they wouldn't budge it, we both got up and ran towards the woods, leaving them alone in the dark, knowing they'd get scared and follow us, which they did. We crawled under the little ripped chunk of fence that kids would use to get into the woods, and then started walking down the little hill into the woods. The girls were very reluctant to follow, but they did. We ran ahead to lose them and hide just to mess with them. As soon as they heard us running, they both yelled to stop. They tried to keep up, but we lost them and hid behind a couple trees. We hid and laughed for a few seconds. Then JJ patted me and told me to look in that direction. And though it was dark, we could see, perhaps only because of the moonlight, barely finding its way through the trees, a towering black figure maybe 15 feet away from us, standing between two trees. It was a horrifying sight. Then they spoke. We just stood there and looked in silence at the figure of the apparent woman, but we both noticed she seemed to be getting bigger and closer very quickly. We didn't see the legs moving, or what we assumed were legs. We heard no footstep sounds. JJ and I turned and ran. We ran and called the girls' names until we found them. Then they followed us out of the woods. We told them to just follow us to the car and run at the car. We finally told them that some 7-foot-tall woman was in the woods. JJ said that if I hadn't seen it as well, he would have thought that he saw an apparition. The girls were freaked out, asking us to tell them that we were kidding. We watched from the car to see if anyone came out of the woods. No one ever did. The biggest question is, why would an older woman be in there at night alone? It's not. Like it was a nature trail. It was a fenced-off, wooded area. Our school didn't have security back then either, so it wasn't that. The four of us went to go hang out at JJ's after, and I'll leave the rest of that night to your imagination. Now we're really fast-forwarding to that summer, when I was working at the school one final time as a summertime custodian, since I got a raise every summer that I'd returned. There were about 4 of us in the building, 2 older custodians and myself. and another 18-year-old. I was in the center courtyard of the school, mowing the grass, when I spotted someone at an upstairs window. It was an older woman. She looked like 65, maybe from the distance, with short curly hair, but her face was kind of blurred behind the glare of the window. I stopped mowing, looked at her, and waved. She didn't wave back. She didn't even move. I basically ran inside to where my boss was and asked who that woman upstairs was. He asked who I told him to follow me. She was in one of the math classrooms. I led him to the upstairs math hallway, but to my surprise, all the classroom doors were closed and the lights were all off. The classroom it looked like she was in was empty. My boss told me there was no one else in the building and that I need to drink some coffee. He went back downstairs, so I did the same. I was genuinely freaked out. After I finished mowing, I started mopping the upstairs hallways and classrooms. Eventually, I was in the math hallway and I would be mopping every last classroom floor up there. So I opened all the doors and turned on all the lights. I had my radio on the floor playing music as usual over the music. I heard a distinct woman's voice. It said, "Young man." It came from one of the classrooms. I couldn't tell which, but I turned off the music and started checking every nearby classroom, desperately hoping to find someone. Every single classroom was empty. I even checked behind the desks. The hairs on my arms were standing up. I felt a fight or flight response kick in. I bailed to the downstairs and told my boss once again. "Someone's up there." I heard a voice now. He once again went up there with me and I explained that I couldn't find anyone but I saw, and now heard a woman up here. When we didn't find anyone again, he told me to go home and take the day off and get some sleep. He thought I was crazy and then put the two incidents together. What if they were connected? What if what JJ and I saw in the woods, what I saw and heard in that classroom are somehow related when I came back to work the next day? I told my boss I just didn't want to work in the math hallway because I was freaked out for the rest of the summer. I didn't go in that hallway again. Ever since then, I full-heartedly believe that my old high school is haunted by some spirit of an older woman. I have no other explanations. When I was in middle school, I was a pretty shy kid. It was the Friday before spring break, and I was pretty excited for it, as my parents were allowing my best friend to stay over for the weekend. Honestly, it was all I could think about the whole day. Now it's important to note that I would never ride the bus to or from school. My parents were pretty protective, and despite living in a relatively friendly neighborhood, they were never keen on the idea of me taking a bus or even just walking home. I didn't mind. But of course, that meant that one of my parents would have to pick me up each day, and each time they did, the school would have whoever was picking me up give them their signature for the school's records. This meant that for me to leave the school, I would need that signature this day specifically, and my aunt and uncle were supposed to pick me up from school as both my parents were working late. But by the time the bell rang, I could tell neither my aunt's or my uncle's car were anywhere in the parking lot. I waited for a good 45 minutes, slowly watching as the parking lot got less and less busy. By this point, almost empty. I was the only one in the lobby at this point and was starting to get nervous that they forgot to pick me up. I decided it was best to walk down to the office and inform someone of the situation. But as I did, I saw some random guy, I'd say maybe mid-40s, with a duffel bag walk in the building. I met eyes with him, but quickly looked back down at the floor, continuing towards the office. When I got there, I told this lady everything. She sat me down in her office. I gave her my aunt and uncle's phone number, and she tried calling them, but of course they didn't answer. And then gave her my dad's phone number, and luckily he did answer. He informed the lady that either my aunt or uncle should have been there by now. He told her he would try calling them as he couldn't get off work for a couple hours. By this point, it had been around an hour and a half since the school got out, and I of course was on edge. The whole situation was stressful, as I knew I was keeping this lady from going home, and I could tell she was losing her patience. I was literally the last kid in the building around 5 minutes later, and nothing had come of the situation yet. But just then, a man in a janitor's uniform walked into the office. I could instantly tell it was the same man with the duffel bag that I'd seen on my way to the office just now, in a janitor's uniform. He started talking with the office lady. I remember this part clearly. The man eventually asked what she was still doing at the school, and she proceeded to explain our whole situation. The man then looked at me and told me he lived right next to my aunt and uncle's house, and that he was willing to give me a ride on his way back home. At that, 2 red flags were going off in my head. Firstly, if I had just seen this guy entering the building only a few minutes ago, why would he already be leaving to go home? And secondly, there's no way he could have even known where my aunt and uncle lived, as that information was never given anywhere in the conversation. But my thoughts were interrupted by the office lady explaining that it was a great idea. I could literally see the relief in her eyes, as she would no longer have to wait for my ride to show up. Not even 2 seconds later, the guy, before I could even say anything in response, grabbed my hand and started practically dragging me towards the front door. I expected the office lady to say something, but as I glanced back at her, I could tell she wasn't going to do anything. But by some stroke of luck, as I was being pulled out the front door, I could see my uncle's car pulling into the parking lot. I screamed that my uncle was here, and the guy froze for a second. But as my uncle got closer, he let go and started speed walking in the opposite direction. Apparently, the reason my uncle was so late was because of some terrible traffic accident. And at the time, he didn't even have a cell phone. So there was no way he could have called the school to inform them. When I got in the car with my uncle, he proceeded to ask me who the guy was that was holding on to me, and I explained everything. He, of course, was shocked and quickly reported the situation to the school. I never saw either that lady or the janitor ever again, so I don't know if they were fired or what. Though I actually have a theory that the guy was never a real janitor for the school, as what janitor would enter the school in regular clothes and leave only minutes after he got there. Either way though, the whole thing was really traumatizing for me, and it still haunts me to this day. When I was about 17, my mom and I moved to a large city, and the UC won't name the city due to what took place. But it's a city most people are familiar with anyway. We moved to the city to start our new lives, as my mom had bought a business and would then take ownership. This meant that I would also have to transfer schools, which was the hardest part of the move. Saying goodbye to your longtime friends paired with all of those super great hormonal imbalances of your high school years. What made it worse was that I was a junior when I moved and would have to spend my senior year with no one I knew. The last day of school came around. I said goodbye to my friends and then rushed to the airport with my mom. The instant I switched schools, I became a totally different person. I was that one outgoing girl who loved her friends, only to become a random nobody who sat alone at lunch. The school itself was okay, but it was nothing like my old school. I had made a few acquaintances, but nobody I actually enjoyed talking to, like my other friends. One day I had been at lunch eating by myself when out of nowhere, a boy I had never seen before decides to sit with me. He introduced himself as Dave and asked if he could sit with me. I tell him yes, and he begins talking about himself and claimed he was also a new student here. We spoke to each other until lunch was over, where he had walked me to my class, which I found thoughtful. It's safe to say I found Dave very relatable. The more we spoke, he had the same interests and even the same family issues. He seemed very sweet, and while he was a bit off, he wasn't a threat or anything. However, little did I know that would be further from the truth. One day, Dave, out of nowhere, had texted me asking about my bra size. I told him I wasn't comfortable answering that, to which he then instantly apologized and changed the topic. But as time progressed, he'd bring up the topic even though I wouldn't want to talk about it. It eventually came to a point where I chose not to speak with him, even when he messaged me first. The same drill applied when he approached me at school too. Eventually, days went by in four. Some reason I didn't see Dave at school anymore. I assumed that he had finally gotten the hint and just stayed clear of me. However, I was dead wrong. The following night, I had been at home on my computer doing a project for chemistry class when I heard something hit my window. Looking back, it kind of sounded like a pebble hitting my window. After all, it was raining outside, so I assumed it was probably the wind blowing away debris. However, it then happened a second time. This time, much louder. I get up from my bed and walk over to the window, and there, crouched, is someone who I could only describe as Dave. He had on his hoodie and gave me an unnerving smile when he saw me. I screamed at the top of my lungs as I saw him and ran to my mom's room to wake her up. My mom is the type of person who is overprotective of her children. So when I told her, she was rightfully pissed. Why my dad isn't home is another story. But my mom puts on her shoes and goes out of the house with a baseball bat. All the while, she's screaming bloody murder, telling whoever was here to leave, or she won't hesitate to knock their teeth in. My mom is a fighter and won't put up with anyone's bees. So when she said that, she meant it. After what felt like hours, she finally came back inside hugging me, and that whoever it was gone. Needless to say, we still felt safer calling the cops, and they take down our info and what had happened. Our emotion sensor light didn't work, so it couldn't alert my mom when someone was outside our house. My mom pulled me out of school for a week and demanded the school sort out the situation with Dave. Turns out, Dave had been in and out of the school for the past year and was not at all a new student. He had been suspended many times for reasons like this, only to get back in for good behavior. How he found my house is a mystery, and quite frankly, I don't want to know. My best guess is that he somehow followed me home, that or he managed to track me. Either way, this is and probably will be the scariest stalker experience I've ever had. I hadn't even known Dave for a month, and already something came up. I still think about this incident from time to time, and just wish I'd be back at my old school. A few weeks later, I moved to another school, where it wasn't the best, but better by a landslide than the other one. Up until now, I try my best to stay clear of social media and outings as I'm still paranoid. This isn't a big county, meaning it was common to run into someone you knew. I hope I never see Dave again.